It's a Spotify podcast. You pushed me down, thought I'd stay on the ground, counting me.
Tuesday mornings in Ashwood always looked the same. People hurried into coffee shops with paper cups in their hands. Teachers drove towards schools thinking about lesson plans. Delivery trucks rumbled down the main street before most people had finished breakfast. The bakery unlocked its doors. The barber swept yesterday's hair from the front step. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual. But that's the thing about the moments that change us. They almost never announce themselves. David Harper parked his aging pickup across the street from Rosa's diner, just as he did nearly every Tuesday for the last 12 years. He wasn't famous. He wasn't extraordinary. He was a history teacher. Most of his students would eventually forget his name. A few never would. He pushed open the diner door, and the little brass bell above it announced his arrival. Rosa looked up from behind the counter and smiled. The usual? Normally David would have smiled back. Normally he would have ordered pancakes, eggs, over easy, bacon, and coffee. Today, he hesitated. Just coffee. Rosa studied him for only a moment. Rough morning? David gave a polite smile. Just thinking. She poured the coffee without asking another question. Some people understand that silence is more valuable than advice. David carried the mug to his favorite booth by the window. Outside, Ashwood continuing being Ashwood, a little girl chased a pigeon across the sidewalk. A man carried a ladder into a hardware store. The crossing guard waved children safely across the street. Nothing unusual. Then David looked up. Across the street stood a woman. She laughed. She stepped towards a man. They embraced. For just a moment, she rested her head against his shoulder. David froze. He looked away, then looked back again. His jaw tightened. He reached for his coffee. He never took a sip. 5 minutes later, he stood, left him enough money to cover the coffee, and walked out without saying another word. Rosa watched him through the window as he drove away. She didn't call after him. She simply watched. Let's stop right there for just a moment. Something important just happened. Not outside the diner, inside David's mind. And if I'm being honest, it may have happened inside yours too. David saw only 4 things: a woman, a smile, a hug, a man. That's all. Everything else came from somewhere else. How many of us quietly assume that the woman was David's ex-wife? How many of us described a man must be someone new? Interesting, because none of those facts actually existed. Our minds don't like unfinished pictures, so they finish them. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're painfully wrong. That tendency has a name. Psychologists call it confirmation bias, but long before it had a name, it was simply part of being a human. David climbed into his truck and headed towards school. At the first red light, his phone rang. The screen read, "Claire." He answered, "You just drove right past us." David frowned. "What?" "I was standing across from Rosa's." "The guy you saw me hugging She laughed. That was Michael, our cousin. A long silence followed. I thought you were mad. David smiled. No, I was just... He couldn't finish the sentence because he finally understood what had happened. Nothing outside the diner had hurt him. The story inside his mind had. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever sent someone a text message and they didn't respond? Maybe it was your husband. Maybe it was your wife. Maybe it was your son. Maybe it was your boss. An hour goes by, then 2, then 6. Without realizing it, your mind begins writing. They're angry with me. I must have done something wrong. Maybe they don't care anymore. What's fascinating is that almost none of us notice the moment the facts end and the story begins. David didn't notice. Most of us don't. Our brains are prediction machines. For hundreds of thousands of years, predicting what happened next helped us stay alive. If the grass moved, our ancestors couldn't afford to wait until they knew whether it was the wind or a predator. The brain filled in the missing pieces. Most of the time, that kept us alive. Today, that same remarkable ability can quietly become a source of unnecessary suffering. Because our brains are still trying to predict the future, even when all we're looking at is a hug across the street. The interesting part isn't that David was wrong. The interesting part is that his conclusion felt completely true. That's what makes confirmation bias so powerful. It doesn't feel like imagination. It feels like observation. And there's a difference. Observation says, I saw a woman hug a man. Interpretation says, she has moved on. Those are not the same thing. Yet our minds often blur the lines between them so quickly that we never notice the transition. Think about how many arguments have started because someone assumed they knew another person's intentions. How many friendships have ended because neither person asked a simple question? How many sleepless nights have been caused by a story that turned out not to be true? David sat at the next red light longer than he needed to. The light had already turned green. The driver behind him tapped the horn. David smiled to himself, not because he was embarrassed, because he realized something. He had spent nearly 20 minutes grieving something that had never happened. Later that afternoon, he found himself standing in front of Rosa's diner again. The little bell announced his arrival. Rosa looked up and smiled. I thought you forgot your jacket. David laughed. No, I forgot something else. She poured a fresh cup of coffee before he even sat down. What was that? David looked out the same window where everything had started only a few hours earlier. My brain got ahead of reality. Rosa nodded as though she had heard that sentence 100 times before. You know, my husband used to do that. David smiled. Really? Oh, yes. He could turn one missing phone call into a whole courtroom trial in his own head. They both laughed. The tension that had followed David all morning began to dissolve. He took his first sip of coffee. Finally. Then he told Rosa everything. How he had seen Claire, how he had assumed the worst, how ashamed he felt once he realized the truth. Rosa didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to make him feel better. She simply listened. Sometimes, being heard is more healing than being advised. When David finished, Rosa slowly slid the coffee mug a little closer to him. Then she said something so quietly, he almost missed it. Most suffering doesn't come from what happened. She paused. It comes from a story we finish before reality gets the chance. David looked back through the window. Across the street, nothing had changed. The hardware store was still open. Children were still laughing. Cars still rolled past. The world had never become dangerous. Only his understanding of it had changed. And somehow, that changed everything. Let me leave you with a thought. Sometime this week, someone is going to disappoint you. Someone will forget to call. Someone will seem distracted. Someone will walk past you without saying hello. When that happens, pay attention. Not just to what happened, but what your mind immediately starts saying about what happened. There's a gap between observation and interpretation. Wisdom often lives inside that gap. One simple question can change everything. What facts do I actually have? Not, what do I fear? Not, what do I assume? Just, what do I know? If David had asked himself that question on Tuesday morning, he would have finished his coffee. David walked outside. The afternoon sun was beginning to settle over Ashwood. He unlocked his truck. Just before climbing in, his phone rang again. This time, it was Principal Reynolds. David, do you have a minute? Of course. I'd like you to stop by my office before first period tomorrow. Everything okay? There was a brief pause. I think so, but I'd like your help with someone. David smiled. I'll be there. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, started the truck, and drove home. He had no idea that tomorrow's ordinary morning would introduce him to someone whose life was about to change his own. And perhaps ours too. My name is Leroy Nellis, and this is Resilience Radio. Godspeed, stand for the Constitution, and never surrender your ability to think for yourself. God bless, and good night. Hey everybody, I wanted to sit down with you today and talk about something we've been working on behind the scenes for quite a while now. First, I want to thank you. Whether you've been here from the beginning or you just found the channel recently, I want you to know that I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Every comment, every conversation, every suggestion, every word of encouragement has helped shape what Resilience Radio is becoming. This isn't just my channel anymore. It's about a community. And because of that, I wanted you to hear these changes directly from me. Over the last several months, we've been doing something a little unusual. We've been studying our analytics almost obsessively. Not just YouTube analytics, but the analytics coming from Naomi, the AI production system we've been building from the ground up. We've been asking questions like, what videos do people come here for? What keeps people watching? What topics naturally fit together? And what happens when we mix very little types of content on the same channel? After looking at thousands of data points, we came to one conclusion. It's time to let each series become a very best version of itself. So today, I'm excited to announce that Rabbit Holes is becoming its own dedicated YouTube channel. Rabbit Holes deserves its own home. It's where we dive into mysteries, history, unsolved questions, and rabbit holes. Strange events, forgotten stories, and all of those fascinating topics that make us lose track of time. By giving Rabbit Holes its own channel, YouTube can better understand who those videos are for. Our AI can learn from much cleaner data, and we can build something truly special for people who love those deep dives. Resilience Radio will continue doing what it has always meant to do, help people understand themselves through psychology, critical thinking, human behavior, wisdom, and resilience. Separating the two channels doesn't mean we're making less content. It actually means that we're going to be making more and better content. So here's what I'd like to do. Right below this video, I've put the links for both channels. Please just take a moment to subscribe to both of them. That way, when a new episode drops, whether it's Resilience Radio or rabbit holes, you'll be notified immediately and won't miss anything. Now, here's one more announcement. And honestly, this is one that I'm about most excited about. We've completely reimaged Loopwired. Loopwired isn't just another educational series anymore. It's become something much bigger. Imagine learning psychology without feeling like you're sitting through a lecture. Imagine following the life of an ordinary history teacher in a small town named Ashwood, a town where nothing extraordinary seems to happen until you begin to realize that the biggest mysteries aren't out there. They're inside the human mind. Every Monday through Friday, you'll follow David Harper as he encounters ordinary moments that quietly reveal extraordinary truths about the way we think. You'll laugh with him. You'll make the same mistakes he makes. You'll discover psychological blind spots before he does, and sometimes after he does. Every episode tells a complete story, but every episode also moves David and hopefully all of us one step closer to wisdom. It's storytelling, psychology, and personal growth woven together into a single journey. And I honestly think it's unlike anything currently on YouTube. Speaking of things unlike anything on YouTube, I have to brag on Naomi for just a minute. Many of you have watched us build her from the ground up. What started as a simple idea has evolved into an AI production partner that is helping us organize stories, manage continuity, analyze content, assist with research, and dramatically improve the quality and consistency of everything we create. She's still learning. We're still improving her, and every week she's becoming faster, smarter, and more capable. Watching this project grow has been one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had, and I can't wait to show what's coming next. Finally, I want to address the In the Box series. I know many of you have been following that story closely. After giving it a lot of thought, I've decided to pause that series until my litigation has reached its conclusion. I want to be able to tell that story completely, carefully, and with the benefit of everything that comes afterward. I think that's the most responsible way to do it. But the story itself isn't stopping. While the litigation moves forward, I'll be writing a book that tells a story in much great depth than YouTube ever could. Books allow for context, documentation, reflection, and details that simply don't fit inside a video. I'm really looking forward to sharing that journey with you, and I hope that you'll come along for it. As always, thank you. Thanks for believing in this project. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for believing in what we're trying to build together. This community has become one of the most thoughtful, encouraging, intellectually curious groups of people I have ever had the privilege of knowing. The future of Resilience Radio, Rabbit Holes, Loopwired, and Naomi has never looked brighter. The next chapter starts now. My name is Leroy Nellis, and this is Resilience Radio. Godspeed, stand for the Constitution, never surrender your ability to think for yourself. God bless, and good night.
You pushed me down, thought I'd stay on the ground, counting me out like the numbers didn't matter. But pressure builds diamonds in the dark, and I've been sharpening my edge in the chatter. Every scar turned into strategy, every setback fueled my clarity. I took the hits, learned the game, turned my losses into flame. Now I'm coming back strong, and you'll remember my name. I'm rising through the fire.